Good evening, everyone. I'm Chris Oppie, a professor of history at UMass Amherst and director of the Ellsberg Initiative for Peace and Democracy. It's my honor to welcome you to the second annual Ellsberg Lecture by acclaimed writer, journalist, and activist Norman Solomon. This lecture is being hosted on the campus of the University of Massachusetts Amherst, which was founded and built on the unceded homelands of the Pocumtuck Nation on the land of the Norwoteg community. We also acknowledge that the University of Massachusetts Amherst is a land-grant university. As part of the Morrill Land Grant Act, portions of land from 82 Native nations west of the Mississippi were sold to provide the resources to found and build this university. I want to say a few words at the outset about Daniel Ellsberg, who is the inspiration for our effort to build a permanent Ellsberg Institute for Peace and Democracy. As most of you know, Ellsberg was our nation's most famous whistleblower. In 1971, he released to the press and public a 7,000-page secret history of the Vietnam War, the Pentagon Papers, that exposed decades of government lies and deceit about the causes and conduct of the war. For that act of profound moral courage, Ellsberg sacrificed his career and risked a lifetime in prison. Late in his trial, the Watergate investigation revealed that Nixon's White House had committed crimes against Ellsberg, which led the judge to find that the prosecution's case was, quote, incurably infected, and therefore the charges had to be dismissed and the trial terminated. In the 50 years that followed, right up to his death at age 92 last June, Dan Ellsberg lived a principled life of nonviolent activism in pursuit of peace, nuclear disarmament, government accountability, First Amendment rights, and social and environmental justice. In 2019, the Robert Cox Special Collections and University Archives at UMass acquired the papers of Daniel Ellsberg, a treasure trove of materials, some 500 boxes. That inspired a number of exciting projects, including a year-long seminar, a series of podcasts, and a 2-day conference. We're now trying to build on Dan's legacy with a permanent institute to promote public understanding, scholarship, and activism in support of compelling democratic and sustainable alternatives to militarism, authoritarianism, and environmental degradation. I'm delighted that with us tonight here is Dan Ellsberg's oldest child, Robert Ellsberg. Robert has his own distinguished career as a writer, activist, and longtime publisher of Orbis books. Among other things, he is one of the world's leading experts on the life and legacy of Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic worker movement, and one of the most profound and important voices of peace in the 20th century. Robert worked very closely with her in the 1970s and went on to write and edit many books that document her life's work. Robert has kindly agreed to say a few words before I introduce Norman Solomon. So, Robert.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for all who've come out this evening and who are watching this. On behalf of my family, I'm very grateful to UMass and for the Ellsberg Initiative on Peace and Disarmament for hosting this lecture, this second annual Ellsberg Lecture, and I'm very glad that it will be provided by Norman Solomon, who was one of my dad's friends and someone he admired very much as a fellow peacemaker. As was mentioned, my dad died in June of pancreatic cancer. I miss him a lot, and so it means so much to me and my family to know that there are people who are keeping his spirit and his legacy alive. He felt bad as he was leaving the earth, that he was leaving us in a situation that he felt was as perilous as any in his lifetime. He felt some peace in the feeling that he had done what he could, and he had hope and confidence that there were others who would follow and carry on the task. And that is joined very much by the commitment that the University of Massachusetts has shown to him. It's incredible, including the establishment of the Ellsberg Archives here at the Du Bois Library, which I visited for the first time today. It was a lot bigger than I imagined, and I frankly couldn't understand how he had fit all that somehow into his house. It seemed to fill half of the library out of the whole floor. So I look forward to coming back and visiting there. I'm so glad for the Ellsberg Initiative on Peace and Democracy, which is not just remembering him for his role in releasing the Pentagon Papers, but for a lifetime of commitment to peace, social justice, human rights, democracy, nonviolence, care for the earth, and the way that he embodied the spirit of engaged scholarship and representing what it really means to be a citizen and a human being in this world. Among other things, the university honored him early this year by conferring on him an honorary doctorate. This was actually the only honorary doctorate he ever received. And he had a doctorate that he had earned 50, 60 years before. And yet it was incredibly meaningful to him to have that kind of recognition. And because of the pandemic, he couldn't come out here before. And apparently the degree has to be presented in person. And so virtually the entire leadership of the university flew out to Berkeley for an amazing ceremony. He modeled for me the robe that he got to keep, and it really meant a lot to him at that occasion. That was just weeks before his diagnosis with pancreatic cancer, so it turned out to be his last public event. So there's definitely a deep connection between his life and memory and this university, for which I'm very, very grateful. So I'm happy to be here tonight. I look forward to returning for future annual lectures. Thanks very much.
And now I'm happy to introduce tonight's Ellsberg Lecturer, Norman Solomon, an author, journalist, and a deeply committed peace activist since the age of 14 in the mid-60s. He has written 13 books, including War Made Easy, How Presidents and Pundits Keep Spinning Us to Death, and most recently, War Made Invisible, How America Hides the Human Toll of Its Military Machine, published just recently by the New Press, which Amy Goodman of Democracy Now! Has called essential reading in these increasingly perilous times. Thanks to Nat and Amherst Books, you can purchase that the book, War Made Invisible, and I'm sure Norman will be happy to sign your copy. Norman is also a fantastic organizer. He's the co-founder and national director of rootsaction.org, an online advocacy nonprofit that now has almost 1.5 million members. He's also the founder and executive director of the Institute for Public Accuracy. Since 1997, the Institute has worked to get progressive scholarship and analysis into mainstream media outlets and has spawned an organization called Expose Facts that has done a great deal to collaborate with and support public interest whistleblowers. He is a longtime good friend of Dan Ellsberg. On numerous occasions, they engaged in acts of civil disobedience alongside each other, and as recently as 2 years ago, they co-authored an article convincingly advocating for the unilateral abolition of America's 400 intercontinental ballistic missiles. Ellsberg said about Norman Solomon, "No one is better at exposing the dynamics of media and politics that keep starting and continuing wars." Welcome, Norman.
One day in 1995, I called Daniel Ellsberg and suggested that he run for president. And his response was instantaneous. He said, "I'd rather be in prison." And when I asked why, he was very quick and very clear to explain. He said, "I can't think of how awful it would be to keep talking about things I don't know much about." It doesn't seem to stop many candidates for president, but For Dan, that was a no-go. And I thought about that conversation many times, and it's often made me go back to an essential question: what did Dan Ellsberg know? He knew from the inside of the U.S. war machine what almost no one who had reached his level of that apparatus was willing to talk about publicly. In my own words, what he knew, and most importantly, what he was willing to share with the public, was that the leaders of the so-called Defense Department and the State Department and people in the Oval Office not only could lie, but did lie frequently without regard for truth and without regard for human life. That realization and that willingness to share that truth is as current at the end of 2023 and as crucial as it was in 1971 when the Pentagon Papers were released. A couple of years ago, when I talked with Dan Ellsberg with the recorder going, this is what he said: that there is deception, that the public is evidently misled by it early in the game, in the approach to war, in a way that encourages them to accept a war and support a war, is the reality. How much of a role does the media actually play in this, in deceiving the public? And how difficult is it to deceive the public? I would say, as a former insider, one becomes aware it's not difficult to deceive them. First of all, you're often telling them what they would like to believe, that we're better than other people. We are superior in our morality and our perceptions of the world. In a book that is as important as any that I've ever read, The Doomsday Machine, Dan starts with an epigraph from Friedrich Nietzsche. It goes as follows: madness in individuals is something rare, but in groups, parties, nations, and epochs, it is the rule. Think of that often in tandem with what Martin Luther King Jr. described as the madness of militarism as real in our day, as when he uttered those words in 1967. Dr. King spoke about what he called the destructive demonic suction tube that drew tremendous quantities of resources away from this country, from human well-being, from healthcare, education, housing, infant care, elderly care, you name it. Walk around Massachusetts or California or any other state, and you won't be far from the deficits as a result, in large measure, of that demonic, destructive suction tube. George Orwell wrote about how sloppy thinking can corrupt language, and language can corrupt thought, and we're immersed in that kind of corrosion and that kind of corruption. We hear and we routinely use terms like defense spending and defense budget, and I'll grant you that there's an uppercase thing called Defense Department, but we see it, we read it, we use it as though that's a lowercase word, defense. A country that spends more on military expenditures than the next 9 nations on the planet combined, and most of those countries are U.S. allies. A country with 750 military bases overseas, with a huge military apparatus, and we're encouraged to believe that all this is going to something called defense. I spent a couple of years working on a book called War Made Invisible. And one of the key resonant truths that came to me anyway, and that I tried to reflect in the writing, is that we have come to be acclimated to seeing the world, experiencing the world, most importantly, hearing it described and depicted by elected officials and media with two tiers of grief. The entire planet divided into people whose lives really matter and people whose lives don't. We may not see it that way conceptually, but we're encouraged to see it that way day after day after day. Lives that really matter and lives don't. And the corrosion of our country, our governance, our media, and even ourselves results. Quick survey. Anyone here in your neighborhood, in your community, in your travels in the United States in the last year or two, you ever seen a flag of the nation of Ukraine? Please raise your hand. Ukrainian flag, anybody? Wow, almost the whole room, almost everybody here has seen the display in solidarity and with the humanity of Ukrainian people who are suffering a horrific invasion, warfare imposed on them by another country. A really appropriate display of solidarity and compassion. Here's the other part of my survey. Please raise your hand if you've seen displayed in your neighborhood or your walk of life, your community, your travels in the United States, the display of a flag of the country of Yemen. Not seeing a single hand, and I can't raise my hand either. Every day, when I go shopping or go to work in my little office, I see the flags of Ukraine. I don't see any Yemeni flags. You may remember the fist bump in the middle of 2022 when President Biden went and met with the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. That kind of solidarity between a country that has sold billions of dollars worth of weapons, provided intelligence to help Saudi Arabia as it slaughters civilians in Yemen. The Media Watch Group FAIR did a study of MSNBC. You know, that's the liberal network, right? It's not Fox. And found almost no coverage whatsoever of the slaughter going on in Yemen. As a matter of fact, this was during the Trump administration, 5,000 times, 5,000% as much coverage of the Russiagate narrative than what was happening in Yemen. That's in spite of the fact that ever since 2015, the US government has been supporting the killing from the air and the massacres by Saudi Arabia of people in Yemen. We might think, well, that's in spite, well, that's odd. The United States government's directly involved. That's in spite of that involvement. We don't have US media hardly paying any attention to it at all. And then with the invasion of Ukraine, huge coverage, empathetic coverage, appropriate coverage of the suffering on the ground in Ukraine. But that was a different tier of grief that's officially sanctified and encouraged. So in Yemen, when children were dying en masse, when the largest cholera epidemic in modern history was taking place courtesy of the Saudi regime with the support of the United States, not newsworthy. So then we might do another comparison. We could do a comparison between two invasions. The invasion of Ukraine, crime against humanity, terrible killing, mostly from the air, the mortars and the rockets and all the rest of it, the invading forces of Russia. That terrible invasion. And the invasion a couple of decades earlier of Iraq. Well, the Media Watch Group FAIR did a study and found during a comparable period, the beginning of those invasions, there were 14 front-page prominent articles about the suffering of Ukrainian people. 14. And during the comparable period, there was one on the same outlet's front page of the New York Times about the suffering of Iraqi people, 14-1. 2 invasions, 2 very different kinds of coverage. And as a matter of fact, I think the US mass media coverage, if you set aside the political spin, which was huge, didn't talk about the role of NATO expanding to Russia's border, on and on and on. But when you look at the actual content of the coverage of US news media, of the suffering of Ukrainian people, it's been exemplary. Corporate media in the United States can convey the real suffering from war if it's inflicted by an official enemy of the United States. But on the other hand, if it's being inflicted by the United States, occasional human interest stories that don't last very long, don't hit the echo chamber, don't have much political effect. This is what is part of what we're told is the rules-based order. You may have heard that phrase from President Biden. You might have heard that phrase from Secretary of State Antony Blinken. We have to have a rules-based order. We can't have chaos. We can't have countries going around invading each other. This became a very popular official phrase in Washington after the invasion of Ukraine. It's a little odd coming from the mouths of Antony Blinken and Joe Biden, because if you flash back to the summer of 2002, Antony Blinken was the chief of staff, and Joe Biden was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee when they helped greenlight the invasion of Iraq, with bogus hearings in the summer of 2002, not allowing skeptics to even testify, and ginning up the momentum for Congress to, months later, approve the invasion of Iraq. So it makes you kind of wonder, what does rules-based order really mean? And it sort of means, it does mean, we make the rules, we break the rules. That's what it really means. It really means do as we say, not as we do. It really means might makes right is our guiding star. That is our North Star, the United States of America. You may remember in 1999, President Clinton, when the US led the NATO bombing of Kosovo and Yugoslavia. We saw the news magazines with the cover stories and the TV accounts and the footage. Ethnic cleansing. We can't allow ethnic cleansing. That's not the American way. Our values require us to stand firm against ethnic cleansing. President Bill Clinton made a speech, and I'm quoting here, he said, "We must adhere to," quote, "the moral imperative of reversing ethnic cleansing," unquote. What's happening right now in Gaza? To call it ethnic cleansing is perhaps too mild a term. We can have an academic or journalistic discussion about whether it's genocide or it's sociocide, but it's mass murder. That's what's going on. Ethnic cleansing, 1999, moral imperative to reverse it. 2023, out of the same Oval Office, get those terrorists. It's unfortunate. Civilians are dying. We will hope that our Israeli allies will not kill so many civilians. That's the message. The US government now rushing through another $14 billion with a B dollars of military aid to Israel as the deaths continue in Gaza. After several weeks of intensive bombing of Gaza, a total of 18 members of the US House of Representatives were willing to co-sponsor a ceasefire resolution. 18 out of 435. We're not talking deep red states here. Let's talk about California. One of the House members from California signed on as a co-sponsor of a resolution urging a ceasefire. In Massachusetts, one member of the U.S. House willing to sign that resolution. Maybe it's significant, maybe it isn't. You be the judge. Every one of those 18 House members who were willing to become a co-sponsor of the ceasefire resolution, every single one of them are people of color. Not a single white member of the House of Representatives willing to co-sponsor that resolution. Back in late October, here in 2023, the Save the Children organization had reported, I'm quoting here, the number of children reported killed in Gaza in just 3 weeks has surpassed the annual number of children killed across the world's conflict zones since 2019. On November 10th, the Director General of the World Health Organization told the United Nations Security Council, quote, on average, a child is killed every 10 minutes in Gaza. Courtesy, I would add, of US taxpayers. And if you do the math, that's about 1,000 kids a week. And when communications were cut off inside Gaza, and people couldn't even communicate with each other in the same community, some of those kids were pulled out of the rubble with the bare hands of adults. We might think about the 96% of the U.S. House of Representatives in 2023 who've declined to co-sponsor a ceasefire resolution. What if their children were being bombed? What if their children had to be pulled out of the rubble? It's not a stretch to say that those members of the House are accomplices to mass murder. It's not a stretch to say that the President of the United States is an accomplice to mass murder. But it's virtually unsayable in US mass media. And the members of Congress, the few willing to even come close to talk about genocide going on, they're withstanding ferocious attacks. No good deed of truth to go unpunished. A few weeks into the bombing of Gaza, there were reliable reports that 180 doctors and nurses had been killed in Gaza. We've had reports of healthcare practitioners in Gaza, in what's left of hospitals, seeing their own families brought in dead on gurneys. That's part of US foreign policy. The poet William Stafford wrote, I call it cruel, and maybe the root of all cruelty, to know what occurs, but not recognize the fact. Sometimes to recognize the fact is just too painful, too difficult, too inconvenient. During the first 5 weeks of the bombing of Gaza, more than 11,000 civilians were killed, including nearly 5,000 children. This in response to the atrocities that Hamas committed on October 7th in Israel, where the latest estimate of the death toll is 1,200, including at least 846 civilians, and also about 200 hostages were taken. We so desperately need in our media, in our politics, in our discourse, a single standard of human rights, of international law, no matter who is committing the atrocities, no matter who is engaging in terrorism. It's really fascinating in an Orwellian analytical sense to see how routinely Hamas is described as a terrorist organization. And it is. And how I can't find a single instance where the US mass media, any one of the outlets, has described the Israeli government as a terrorist organization. But if we have the same standard, that would be appropriate. And then what do we say about the biggest accomplice to that terrorist organization called the Israeli government? That would be the United States government. What does it mean when you're an active accomplice? You know, they're busting gun dealers for selling assault rifles to somebody who shoots up a supermarket or a school. Those people are prosecuted. But 400 and more members of the House of Representatives, the guy behind the office desk in the Oval Office, dare not even say that they have an accomplice role. That's a bridge too far. That's not allowed. We have to mind our P's and Q's. Because terrorism is defined as is convenient. And so when the US government, and it's very good at this, kills from the air, we're above it all. That's not terrorism. It's a 180 we're made to understand from packing a bunch of explosives in the trunk of a car and driving it into a target. Something that I've wrestled with a lot and wrote about in War Made Invisible is that question of intentionality. That's part of the conceit in the United States, in Israel, and elsewhere. Oh, we don't target civilians, unlike those bad terrorists. We don't target civilians. And yet, throughout the so-called war on terror and now what's going on in Gaza, the effect is absolutely the same because the civilian deaths are absolutely predictable. And the people giving the orders at the top know that. But it's a sort of a shell game pretense. Oh, we don't target them. No, we kill them. We know we will kill all those civilians, so many, but that's okay. We've given ourselves an out. And the mass media, of course, go along with that. That's fine. There's a lot of talk these days, of course, about we shouldn't make students uncomfortable. I'm not just talking Florida here. I'm talking every state in this country. We have people saying, sometimes in very high places, positions of authority, mass media, civic groups saying, we must not make students uncomfortable. They shouldn't have to hear things that make them uncomfortable. And then, of course, we could think, I wonder how comfortable students have been in Gaza for the last few weeks. When our own country is directly involved, directly complicit, but we shouldn't make anybody uncomfortable by sharing information about it, showing some of the results. The problem is not people being too uncomfortable. The problem is people being too comfortable and encouraged to be too comfortable. Whether it's the US warfare state, whether it's corporate power, whether it's the grievous inequities of wealth and terrible poverty and the systemic racism. Comfort? That we're supposed to be comfortable? We're supposed to adjust ourselves to that? The whole mentality that is officially promulgated and encouraged is that when the United States does things that aren't quite right, that's an anomaly. It's not systemic. Oh, it's just an anomaly. The mistakes are made. But actually, the atrocities become routine. They become built in because they are organized that way. Aldous Huxley said, the propagandist's purpose is to make one set of people forget that certain other sets of people are human. That's the unspoken messaging that is so much a part of these two tiers of grief. On the planet, the United States has 4% of the world's population. And yet, with the window on the world tinted red, white, and blue, we're encouraged to believe that, hey, it's about us. It's really about us. The anomalies we're encouraged to believe, just don't say who we are. You know how that is. That's not who we are. Maybe it is, but part of who we are is to tell each other that that's not who we are. Early in the 19th century, soon after the US military slaughtered huge numbers of people in the Philippines, the American author William Dean Howells wrote a short story. It was called Editha. And in that short story, one of the characters says, "What a thing it is to have a country that can't be wrong, but if it is right anyway." I can't think of a more contemporary comment than one that was written more than a century ago. And coming along with that is the absence of remorse. It's really stunning. You know, I'm in my early 70s, so I've been alive during the going on from the Vietnam War. Keep looking for remorse. 3 million Vietnamese people, the slaughter in Laos and Cambodia, illegal, immoral. People being killed on the Plain of Jars in Laos who had never even heard of the United States. Where was the remorse, and where is the remorse? Well, in 1964, one of the only two members of the entire House and Senate to vote against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that opened the floodgates to the Vietnam War, Wayne Morse said, "I don't know why we think just because we're mighty that we have the right to try to substitute might for right." And that's the US policy in Southeast Asia, just as unsound when we do it as when Russia does it. I want to share with you something that our best ex-president said when he was president, when he was commander-in-chief. Jimmy Carter, in 1977, 2 months after he moved into the White House, he was asked at a news conference if he felt, the reporter put it this way, "Do you feel, quote, any moral obligation to help rebuild Vietnam?" Here's how President Jimmy Carter replied, "Well, the destruction was mutual. You know, we went to Vietnam without any desire to capture territory or to impose American will on other people. We went there to defend the freedom of the South Vietnamese. And I don't feel that we ought to apologize or to castigate ourselves or to assume the status of culpability." Well, there's not enough time to do justice to the war since then. Grenada, Panama in the 1980s, 1991, according to the Pentagon, 100,000 Iraqis killed in 6 weeks. That was taken as a great triumph. And first President Bush saying, quote, "By God, we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome once and for all." 1999, 78 straight days of bombing led by the United States, Yugoslavia, and Kosovo. Not a single American died. Great triumph. Cluster bombs being used. I remember reading one of the rare accounts a woman in Nice was shopping at a market on a Friday. She was found in a pool of blood holding carrots from the cluster bombs of the United States. By the way, it's not a secret. You can go to the Congressional Research Service and find that during the first 3 weeks of the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, the United States used between 1.8 and 2 million cluster munitions bomblets to shred the bodies of everybody, and one of the most heinous, terrible weapons in modern warfare. We hardly ever heard about it. And in fact, you may remember, to fast forward, that when the Russians invaded Ukraine and it was reported that they were using cluster munitions, they were justifiably denounced by US media, and the White House publicly suggested that might well be a war crime. But then the Ukrainian forces were running out of weapons and ammunition, and the US was running out of resupply ammunition. but the U.S. had plenty of cluster munitions on the shelf. And so President Biden, with bipartisan support in Congress, gave the green light, and there went on from there huge shipping of cluster munitions to Ukraine. It wasn't so bad after all. So how Orwellian can you get? 2022? A war crime. 2023? No problem. No problem at all. In 1996, you may remember seeing or reading this exchange on 60 Minutes, CBS correspondent Leslie Stahl and Madeleine Albright, then the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. "We've heard that 500,000 children have died," Stahl said, before asking, "Is the price worth it?" This was about sanctions the U.S. was imposing on Iraq. "Is the price worth it?" Madeleine Albright was asked. Albright replied, "I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it." Her exact words. A little maladroit, wouldn't you think? But candid, unusual candor. Less than a year later, Albright was nominated to become the U.S. Secretary of State. She was confirmed by the U.S. Senate 99-0. Do you think that if she had said that the killing of any of the children of members of the Senate was a price that was worth it, do you think the vote would have been unanimous? This is one of countless examples of the tears of grief, the corruption, the corrosion, if you will, the spiritual desecration of U.S. government, of mass media, and of our own lives, to the extent we accept it. 6 years after Madeleine Albright became Secretary of State, in the fall of 2002 in Baghdad, I met a few of the surviving Iraqi children. UNICEF's director in Baghdad took me around to some schools. The ones that had been refurbished were really nice. There was no drafts. There was no smell of sewage. But other schools, I was taken to another one, had not yet been refurbished. They were working on it. The UNICEF office there was trying to provide schools for kids that didn't have sewage smell and broken windows. It was really impressive. And so we went back to the director's office. He was a Dutch person who was running the operations in Iraq for UNICEF. And we talked about how important the improvements were. And then I asked, what do you think will happen if the U.S. invades? And there was a silence. And then he said, that would be a whole different matter. And it was. It was branded in Baghdad by the U.S. media with great excitement, shock and awe. Daniel Ellsberg talked with me about the differences between media coverage of 9/11 and later the U.S. military's shock and awe missile attack on Baghdad that started the Iraq invasion in March of 2003. In response to 9/11, he recalled, the New York Times, and I'm going to quote Dan here, did something very dramatic. They ran a head picture of each person who had been killed, 9/11. Each person had been killed with some anecdotes from their neighbors, their friends, their family. This person liked to skydive, or this person liked to play in a band, or little anecdotes about what made them human, what people remembered about them in particular. Very gripping, very moving. And then there was a pause, and Dan went on, and he said, after the Iraq War began in 2003, he said he thought, imagine if the Times were to run a page or two of photographs of the people who were burned on the night of shock and awe. It wouldn't be that hard if you were on the ground. We weren't there then, but we were later, to find people who were relatives of those people and say, look, each one had friends, had parents, had children, had relatives. Each one had made their mark in some little way in the world until that moment when they were killed. And these were the people we killed. And these were the people who were dying under the bombing, exactly as in our case, where 2 planes filled with gas burned 2 buildings. Dan went on to say, but of course, that kind of U.S. media coverage was unthinkable. He put it this way: of course, it's never happened, nothing like it. Tears of grief. In 2009, when I went to Afghanistan, I went somewhere that any U.S. journalist was free to go. It was a refugee camp, an internal refugee camp. And it was largely populated by people from the Helmand province in the south who had been driven out by the violence. And it was a very crude makeshift camp, just a bunch of ditches and canvas, basically. And I met a girl named Guljuma. At the time, she was 7 years old. And she talked about how one morning, when she was still sleeping, about 5 a.m., at her home in Helmand province, the walls fell in because a bomb had fallen in the neighborhood. The U.S. was bombing the area. And as she spoke, you could see her kind of tilting her body because she only had one arm. And so the side with an arm was sort of in my direction. So she's in her early 20s now with one arm, if she's still alive. And I found out that at that refugee camp, because they were internal refugees, the UN wasn't helping, the Afghan government wasn't helping, the US government was not helping. They took up collections for food from local business people in Kabul. As a US citizen, I thought about it. I thought, wow, my government had the money to bomb these people, but not to feed them. The next year, in 2010, President Obama spoke to troops near Kabul at Bagram Air Base. He said, all of you represent the virtues and the values that America so desperately needs right now: sacrifice and selflessness, honor and decency. And he added, quote, you see dignity in every human being. But even though the United States, quote, lost the Afghanistan war, the fact is that military contractors never lose a war. And so Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, General Dynamics, many other corporations, they always make a literal and figurative killing. William Hartung has authored a report, the great researcher. He found weapons makers have spent $2.5 billion on lobbying over the past 2 decades. They employ on an average over 700 lobbyists per year, more than one for every member of Congress. There's a revolving door between the lobbyists and members of Congress. It swings both ways. The current Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, is a former member of the board of Raytheon Technologies, the country's largest military contractor. He was getting 7 figures income from the military industry. He worked closely with the top diplomats of the United States, and if you go to Open Secrets online, you'll find that they discovered and documented before entering the Biden cabinet, Austin and Secretary of State Antony Blinken worked together at a place called Pine Island Capital Partners, described as a private equity firm investing in defense companies that touted its access to Washington. My only correction is they weren't defense companies. They were military companies. You might remember that before the Iraq invasion, the Pentagon, you have to brand these days, right? So they came up with a name for the impending Iraq invasion in 2003. And naturally, they wanted something that sounded rather grand and wonderful. So somebody there got approval to call the invasion Operation Iraqi Liberation. But there was something wrong. You can probably guess if you can't remember. There was something wrong with the name of the invasion being Operation Iraqi Liberation. Just think of the initials. Operation Iraqi Liberation. Since the acronym spelled oil, somebody realized that wouldn't do, right? So, of course, it was considered a calumny to suggest with the impending invasion that oil had something to do with it because, the United States government, we're virtuous, we're altruistic, we try to help other people. And we were told that's what the invasion was about. But then the years went by and some people retired and the loose lips, they weren't sinking ships, but maybe they could sell a book or two. And so some officials began to speak very differently. So 4 years after the invasion, I'll give you a couple quotes. The senator and actually future Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel, said, quote, "People say we're not fighting for oil. Of course we are," unquote. General John Abizaid, who knew something about fighting in Iraq, he was the former head of U.S. Central Command and military operations in Iraq for the U.S. military, he said, quote, "Of course it's about oil. We can't really deny that," unquote. Well, if we step back and we look at the so-called war on terror, which has been continuing, it's gone on for 22 years, we can find some real information about the consequences. One of the great myths, and Biden made a statement at the UN in September 2021 that we've turned a page. He said the U.S. is no longer at war, which of course would be confusing to people in countries the U.S. was continuing to bomb, including in the last week here in the middle of November 2023 in Syria. We were told that the U.S. wasn't at war anymore because troops had come out of Afghanistan, which was really surprising to people who looked at reports from the Costs of War project at Brown University. The same month that Biden made that statement, the project documented U.S. military was engaged in so-called counterinsurgency and war on terror operations in 85 different countries. That's quite a gap between no countries and 85. Bombing, missile strikes, drone attacks, joint maneuvers with foreign militaries, on-the-ground advisors and trainers, secretive special ops, by definition secret. And then there's the militarization of our economy or culture, a society teaching men to use guns to kill, domestic violence, which is clearly documented, way up among veterans, especially those engaged in the war on terror. Home, terrifying for many women, domestic violence through the roof. PTSD, the kind of messaging we get that says this is heroic to go out to kill and even risk to be killed. And then when George Floyd was murdered, and there were Black Lives Matter demonstrations around the country, many demonstrators in many cities and towns found that they were facing off against Pentagon equipment. Because there's something called the 1033 program. MRAPs and other major weaponry systems and armaments are given by the Pentagon to local police forces around the country. And if they don't use them, they have to give them back. We've been hearing a lot, not enough, but since the death of George Floyd, we've been hearing more about systemic racism. And there's an assumption that it's only a domestic problem. One of the things that was startling to me, I was working on the War Made Invisible book for months, and then I started a chapter called Color of War, and then I realized ever since the so-called War on Terror began in October 2001 with the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, almost every victim of Pentagon firepower has been a person of color. It's hidden in plain sight. How many op-eds and commentaries have you seen in mass media even mentioning that? Too embarrassing? Too obvious? It wouldn't have surprised W.B. Du Bois. Wouldn't have surprised him at all. The color line doesn't just run through this country, it's global. To be clear, the United States military doesn't bomb countries because they're inhabited by people of color. But if they're inhabited by people of color, that makes it easier for domestic politics and attitudes to engage in warfare on that country. Otherwise, our entire analysis of systemic racism would make no sense. Institutional and individual, we have these biases. And religious and cultural biases too. And as the slaughter continues in Gaza, all of those factors are in play. The two tiers of grief. Of all the wars that the United States has been part of, in so many ways, with so many layers, there is invisibility. Even if it's on our TVs, even if it's in the newspapers and on our screens, the realities of the war are invisible. Yeah, we can see the images, and we're virtually clueless. Remember the old cliche, television brings war into your living room? Sounded good, didn't it? Completely preposterous. Can you think of anything less like being in a war than scrolling on your smartphone or watching a television? But it's something that doesn't stand any scrutiny, but it's very popular because we need that conceit that we are witnessing, we're visible. But what Robert J. Lifton calls psychic numbing, the numbing is crucial to make these policies acceptable to the public. And most of all, in terms of war that would be invisible, is nuclear war. There would be virtually no one left to see the coverage. 8 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, President John Kennedy spoke at American University. And he drew lessons from that crisis that are now in the dumpster at the White House. This is what Kennedy said. Above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. At the time of that speech by JFK in 1963, Daniel Ellsberg was working for the Kennedy administration. As he told an interviewer a few years ago, and quoting here, Dan said, "What I discovered to my horror, I have to say, is that the Joint Chiefs of Staff contemplated causing with our own first strike 600 million deaths, including 100 million in our own allies." Now, that was an underestimate even then because they weren't including fire, which they found was too incalculable in its effects. And of course, fire is the greatest casualty-producing effect of thermonuclear weapons, so the real effect would have been over 1 billion, not 600 million, about a third of the Earth's population then, at that time. Speaking after his book, The Doomsday Machine, was published in 2017, Dan brought us up to date, up to our present era. He described research findings about nuclear winter. And this is what he said. It's a long quote. It's definitely worthwhile. What turned out to be the case 20 years later in 1983, confirmed in the last 10 years very thoroughly by climate scientists and environmental scientists, is that the high ceiling of 1 billion or so was wrong. Firing weapons over the cities, even if you call them military targets, would cause firestorms in those cities, like the one in Tokyo in March of 1945, which would loft into the stratosphere many millions of tons of soot and black smoke from the burning cities. It wouldn't be rained out in the stratosphere. It would go around the globe very quickly and reduce sunlight by as much as 70%, causing temperatures like that of the Little Ice Age, killing harvests worldwide and starving to death nearly everyone on Earth. It probably wouldn't cause extinction. We're so adaptable. Maybe 1% of our current population of 7.4 billion could survive, but 98 or 99% would not. So we have a double-barreled climate emergency. The organizing on campuses and elsewhere on climate has been so crucial, so important. We have this existential crisis that is misnamed a climate crisis. It's a climate emergency. And then we have the specter of nuclear war, which, if it occurs, would be speeded up climate crisis, climate emergency to an unfathomable degree. So as I wrap up here, I want to remind you that while Daniel Ellsberg was extremely well informed about war and U.S. war making, he had seen it unfold during the Vietnam War. His deepest passion, and reflected in his great book, The Doomsday Machine, has been to prevent nuclear war and to wake us up. He says in the book that the single step that could be initiated to reduce the chances of nuclear war would be, yes, unilateral shutdown of all U.S. ICBMs, the intercontinental ballistic missiles. They're on hair trigger alert because, unlike the air and the sea nuclear weapons, they're vulnerable to a first strike. So they are, by definition, kept on launch on warning, hair trigger status. William Perry, former Secretary of Defense, has said ICBMs are the most dangerous weapons in the nuclear arsenal. And yet we can't get anywhere so far in Congress to get them shut down. And part of the charge is, oh no, that would be unilateral disarmament. And I think of it as, let's say you're standing in a pool of gasoline, and your adversary is also standing in the pool of gasoline. And you're lighting matches, and your adversary is lighting matches. If you stop lighting matches, people might say, oh, that's unilateral disarmament. It would also be a step of sanity. In The Doomsday Machine, Dan summed up this way. He described the overall policies of preparing for all-out thermonuclear war. No policies in human history have more deserved to be recognized as immoral or insane. The story of how this calamitous predicament came about and how and why it has persisted for over half a century is a chronicle of human madness. Whether Americans, Russians, or other humans can rise to the challenge of reversing these policies and eliminating the danger of near extinction caused by their own inventions and proclivities remains to be seen. I choose to join with others in acting as if that is still possible. We all know about Dr. King's speech, I Have a Dream. But when he went down by the riverside to a church in New York City in 1967 and denounced what he called the madness of militarism, that's a no-go for corporate media, the politicians, the Democrats and Republicans who embrace his memory have that part of his legacy down the Orwellian vacuum tube. Dr. King said, quote, I must honestly say to you that I never intend to adjust myself to the madness of militarism. It's easy to feel overwhelmed. It's easy to feel powerless. But the only possibility of change is if we organize. And if we have a realistic view, not of the fantasy world provided to us by members of Congress overwhelmingly and by presidents and by media, but our own willingness to see. As James Baldwin said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. The poet Stanley Kunitz wrote, "In a murderous time, the heart breaks and breaks, and lives by breaking. It is necessary to go through dark and deeper dark, and not to turn." And from Theodore Retke, "In a dark time, the eye begins to see." Daniel Ellsberg was accustomed to people telling him how much he inspired them. But I sensed in his eyes and in his heart a persistent question. Inspired to do what?
Well, that was magnificent. I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about how corporate media effectively censors dissenting voices.
In the lead up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, as I remember, there were a little bit more than 800 sources brought into network television. One of them represented a U.S. peace group, so that's a rather small percentage. I can share a little bit of a personal experience because at the Institute for Public Accuracy, we were generating a lot of news releases, and then I went to Baghdad in September of 2002 with former Senator James Aberask and Congressman Nick Rahal and Jim Jennings from Conscience International, and we met with the second in command, Tariq Aziz, by the way, good example of the urbanity of evil, well-cut suit, good English, sort of like people in Congress. And when I got back, it was possible to get on CNN and MSNBC, to get yelled at Fox, stuff like that. So I did maybe a dozen appearances. This was, autumn 2002. But after the House and Senate voted to go to war in October of 2002, the doors really started to close. And that was true of a lot of our experts at the Institute for Public Accuracy. We were churning out 4, 5, 6, 7 news releases a week. So the more it became official doctrine that the United States should go to war and was bipartisan to invade Iraq, it was harder and harder to get on cable. And then, of course, once the war begins, it's just like salute. That's the... It's an ironic manifestation of embedding. It's just another psychological embedding that goes on.
Right, and you pointed out in the book that Phil Donahue lost his show, and he was one of the few voices to a big audience raising these questions.
Yeah, there are a lot of object lessons. I mean, people in journalism, I don't think they're any more or less brave than people in other professions. It's difficult to bite the hand that signs the paycheck. In foreign countries, the real dictatorships, if you step out of line, you might go to prison or get shot. In the United States, you've got mortgages, you've got your kids' college tuition to worry about. And so this is a self-policing sort of thing, and there are object lessons. I mean, maybe the most powerful object lessons are the successes, the professional successes. The tacit understanding when it comes to U.S. wars is in U.S. mass media, if you're pro-war, you're objective. If you're anti-war, you're biased. And that was manifested for Phil Donahue, who did very well, had a primetime show on then a young network, MSNBC. And we don't have to conjecture because there was a leak of memos from top management at MSNBC, and they fretted in writing that he actually allowed anti-war voices on in the latter part of 2002 to challenge the rush to war. Can you imagine? That was just seen as irresponsible and dangerous. As the memo said, our flag-waving competitors at Fox and CNN would be quite a contrast. And so they ditched the guy they ditched the show a few weeks before the invasion. Another example, which I'm really glad I got into in the book because I haven't seen it reported anywhere after the time, and that was the object lesson of Ashley Banfield. You may remember that Banfield was an up-and-coming, very popular young anchor and host, especially reporter for MSNBC. She was at 9/11, she was at the Twin Towers, she was dispatched to many countries in the Middle East in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq. She covered the invasion. Then she made a professional mistake. She was real truthful about the quality of the coverage. Ironically enough, it was in Manhattan, Kansas, on a college campus. And the bigwigs back in the other Manhattan at NBC in New York, they just freaked out because she had the temerity to say that there's a difference, as she put it, between coverage and journalism. And she said people at the networks, they were very happy about the coverage of the invasion of Iraq. You saw how the missiles could be launched. You saw where they landed. She said, but I can assure you it's not just a puff of smoke and dust when they land. And for her temerity, she was read the Riot Act. There were memos and news releases immediately from NBC and MSNBC management saying Ms. Banfield does not speak for her colleagues or for the network. And she was escorted to her new office, which was basically a tape closet, and was not let out of her contract. And so her career at the really big networks was basically foreclosed. So that, again, is an object lesson. So you got the positive object lesson. No matter how much you swallowed the lies about weapons of mass destruction, no matter how much, like Dan Rather, after 9/11, you went on TV and said, I'll go wherever the president says, I'll salute him, I'm an American. No matter how obsequious you were to obey the messaging and respond to the edicts of the top U.S. officials, that's a career advancement. But then these few object lessons, unfortunately few, of courageous journalists, many in the profession, they see how the wind blows.
We have a few hundred people watching online. Got a question from one of them who asks, what are some concrete things we can do to transform our culture of militarism?
Yeah, it's a great question. We have to organize, and we need institutions that can be supported. The mass media are so powerful. I mean, we're here in Massachusetts, and a few miles away is the Media Education Foundation, a fantastic resource, has educated millions of people about media, about politics, about culture. The Media Watch Group FAIR is a resource that I hope everyone will sign up for action alerts if you haven't already. You get the research and you get action possibilities with follow-up for the kind of media coverage that we shouldn't be getting overwhelmed with, but we are. I'm part of rootsaction.org, where we now have over 1 million people who have signed up as supporters. We have action alerts. Those are just a few examples of how we should support independent media and activist institutions. We can't do it alone. We got to work with each other.
FAIR, which Norman helped establish, stands for Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting.
Right.
Yeah, there's a microphone floating around.
Thank you for your talk, Norman, and I appreciate your moral passion and the humanitarian perspective especially. But I wanted to ask you about another aspect of the madness of militarism, and that is the depth to which the American economy is tied into what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. And in political terms, what is it that we can do? How is it that we can create the kind of movement that Dr. King, I think, had envisioned, which is to say, making sure that we see the connections between foreign policy, militarism, poverty, racism, inequality at home. The only person I can think of these days who's, is William Barber, who has talked a great deal about this. But we can't just talk about how this is a problem of the media and how this is a problem of people getting the wrong information. We know politically that it's very, very difficult for a congressman or a senator right, to vote against military bases or procurements for his or her districts. This is a deep structural problem that people like Seymour Melman and others have written about for many, many years. So I just wonder if you would comment on that.
Yeah, Melman was the first, maybe 40 years ago at least, to write extensively about it. The intersection between mass media, corporate media, in which I include NPR and PBS, All Things Considered, Morning Edition, PBS NewsHour, the intersection between the media and the political establishment and the corporate military contractors, it's a distinction that almost is to the vanishing point. There's the personal revolving doors, but also the interlocking directives and the sensibilities, if you will. They're reading from the same, singing from the same corporate military choir book, and there's an understanding. I mean, we need more sociologists to look at it in detail because people tend to be conformist. People tend to want to succeed in their profession. It's really hard to go against the grain. And so, as you point out, part of the tactic is virtually every congressional district has some facet of military contracting. It's mind-blowing. And you'll go to a state and people say, hey, we have a lot of military contractors here. And then you go to another state, people, if they've researched it, will say the same thing. So I agree that media is not some discrete area. It has its own functionality, but it's intersected with so much else of the power structure, the power elite. And so to free associate with C. Wright Mills, there's a lot of crackpot realism around. And we've got many members of Congress. I think that's why it's mind-blowing that we have more than 400 members of the House who have not signed a ceasefire resolution. I mean, it's in part that $14 billion of new weaponry that's virtually on the way to Israel. I mean, this is an unprecedented deal, as I talk about in the book. $38 billion with a B dollars guaranteed over a 10-year period. We're about 7 years into that 10-year stretch. But that's not enough. Now they're going to ship $14 billion more. And so there's I think, a moral horror going on that's almost hard to overstate. When the U.S. is helping another government to exterminate children at a rate of 1,000 a week, and it's become normal, and it's lucrative.
Any students here who would like to ask a question?
I'm a high school student, is that okay?
Sure,
Yeah,
of course.
sure.
All the better.
I just have a question. Would you define the rampant militarism in America as fascistic?
Good question, and thank you. I think there are fascistic elements. The objectification of other people to such an extreme extent, like the quote I had from the author of Brave New World, where he said that the propagandist's purpose, and it's eerie because he wrote this in 1936, right? The propagandist's purpose is to make people believe that some other people are not really human. That's a fascistic mission. And I think there are elements of that when you have leaders who are willing to authorize the slaughter of other human beings who are as much civilians as their own kids, if they have kids. It's a clue that there's something deeply wrong going on, especially when it's so systemic. I mean, when we have, in the case of the Cost of War project at Brown University, the numbers are staggering. The Brown University studies have found that about 950,000 people have been directly killed by the U.S. post-9/11 wars. And about 405,000 of them, so almost half, were civilians. So you look at I think this is a bit fascistic. It's a sort of displaced rage, collective punishment that has gone on for 20 plus years, where here you have the United States of America after 9/11, and then you look at these conservative numbers and you see that what the U.S. government has done is that for every innocent soul that was extinguished on 9/11. The U.S. has extinguished 100 equally innocent souls. 3,000, 400, and 5,000. And then you go to indirect. The Brown University study has found that the cascading effects, not just directly people got blown up, but healthcare facilities, housing, infrastructure, sanitation, the ripple effects, sociocide, 4.5 million people killed by the United States in this displaced rage. So then you look at those numbers for what good numbers are. That means for everybody who was killed on 9/11, the United States has killed 1,000 people. Well, that sounds pretty fascistic to me.
We have another question came in online, wanting to know, in effect, how the peace movement might be more effective. Are there sort of new approaches, new tactics that you're thinking of?
Yeah, that's great question. Well, as I mentioned, I think organizing is crucial. Our organization, which is little in the big picture, but at rootsaction.org, we're really into organizing. There are a lot of groups who are doing that. It's encouraging when on this campus, people are willing to and did engage in nonviolent civil disobedience to say we need a ceasefire. I mean, what do we come to that ceasefire is controversial? You know, it's not. How many civilians do you need to kill before there needs to be a ceasefire? We're up to 11,000 civilians killed in the last 5 weeks in Gaza. Isn't that enough? What is the threshold here? I think that part of what is really essential is that we distinguish between militancy and violence. Dr. King talked about what he called the need for the marvelous new militancy. We're too goddamn nice to elected officials. There's something wrong in my state of California and in the state of Massachusetts and all the other ones where we can't get but 4% of the House of Representatives to call for a ceasefire. I mean, what's the madness that Nietzsche was talking about? It's very, very present. And so, to be more specific, there's undue deference from peace activists, social justice activists, in terms of their member of the House and their senators. So polite, so nice. Oh, thank you for all the good stuff you do. That's not enough. They're not doing us a favor by doing good things. If there's a problem, we need a solution, and they've got the power, and we need to demand it. We need a lot more sit-ins at congressional offices. We need much more confrontation. Certainly, you shouldn't be violent about it, but we need confrontation because these members of the House and Senate and the president in the White House, they're getting away with murder right now, quite literally.
International law, but that's proposed as a guiding force, something we can push. International law means we can say it's bad when Russia does it, it's bad when Israel does it, it's bad when Saudi Arabia does it. It starts to look like a huge leap forward to embrace international law. If you start to talk about it, left and peace organizations and members, they just get kind of bored with it. It doesn't seem to be what's driving them, right? Or it seems to be off subject in terms of what they'd like to see. I guess in the institutions organizing international law are rather elitist. Like at Roots Action, does international law help? Or is it kind of a distant sideshow?
I think it's one of the doors that we should keep opening. Try all those doorknobs, see what we could work. In terms of international law, of course, the International Criminal Court, the U.S. refuses to be part of it. You know, they want other people to go on trial, but they're worried that they might be, so why should they be part of it? You know, I have a lot of favorite theoreticians, you know, C. Wright Mills, others, Dr. King. Also right up there is Lewis Carroll in Through the Looking Glass, where I think it's Alice is talking to Humpty Dumpty. And she says, the question is, how can you make one word mean so many different things? And Humpty Dumpty replies, the question is, who has the power? That's all. And this bears on international law. And it's fascinating to me that in his tweets, what do they call it, POTUS, right? in his tweets on more than one occasion, as well as in White House news releases if you go to the official website, you have President Biden using the phrase international humanitarian law. And it's sort of a open sesame phrase, as though all you got to do is say that phrase, and you're on the side of the angels. So repeatedly, Biden has said, and spokespeople at the State Department and Pentagon, it's really hard to tell the difference between those two agencies, they have said, we support Israel, we condemn terrorism, and we are absolutely committed to the defense and support of Israel, and we support them, the Israeli government defending itself within the bounds of international humanitarian law. So the inference is, well, we said it, so what's the problem here? So that children keep dying. I mean, it's mind-blowing to me that the hospitals have been bombed, the carnage, as I mentioned, the nurses, the doctors, how much more inhumane would it be possible to get towards the 2.3 million people in Gaza? But it's as though saying international law, like Washington is telling the Israelis, do that. And so, that said, I think that we need adherence. We just need a single standard of international law. It gets back to the craziness of a rules-based order phrase that the U.S. keeps telling the world that Russia violates a rules-based order. I mean, you're sort of at the Mad Hatter's Tea Party, really.
I think it might be good to end with Alice in Wonderland. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you to those watching at home, and especially thank you to Norman Solomon and to Robert.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you.